its high, high hay. The army's on its way. Held off the cage is loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, good evening. Welcome to Pegasus Research, Substack Week in Review, Unscripted number 9 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a member or becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Just one notice, I want to put this out there, is that U.S. Army song, which was awesome, is public use. That is my own recording of the U.S. Army band. So it's, again, general use. There's no copyright infringement. All right, so we're going to talk about this week, the 3 articles this week. The first one was Switzerland to host a Ukraine peace conference, doubling down on delusion. The second is the Philippines challenge another Chinese incursion in its exclusive economic zone. And finally, the China-Russia summit snap meeting to react to Western sanctions. So we'll start first with Switzerland to host a Ukraine peace conference, doubling down on delusion. The question is, for when I start forming this paper, Switzerland is hosting the Ukraine peace talks in June 2024, but the talks are fundamentally flawed to the Russians not being invited. What are the Ukrainians and the Swiss going to do to salvage the talks? Obviously, it's being recognized internationally that when you don't invite one of the two combatants, there is something flawed about even having a peace conference. So right now it's still in flex. There's still countries being invited. Some still have to be. Some more will attend. Some might drop out, especially considering the pressure that the Russians are not going to be involved in it. Not that the Russians have a ton of friends, but I think there is probably countries don't want to be seen as picking one side or the other, especially in a peace conference format that is as fundamentally flawed as this one. So, as everybody knows, I'm reading a lot of my articles. If you've been around with me for a while, the Ukraine peace has been one of my primary subjects to keep coming back and visiting. I think we're looking at over 700,000 killed between the two sides. Absolutely devastating war. So the conference in Switzerland is expected to have 160 national delegates. That might change from up to 100 countries. That might change as well. And this is a product of the public relations campaign of Ukrainian President Zelensky when he lobbied for attendees to attend when he was at the 2024 World Economic Forum at Davos. So the original idea was he was going to present his 10-point peace plan. I have talked about this many times, that this is an absolutely ridiculous document. It is more of a wish list. It is not a serious roadmap for peace. I have a number of papers. I think the Turkish proposal, which is a sad state of affairs, but the Turkish proposal is probably the most realistic proposal that's on the table right now, though it's not being seriously considered right now. Zelensky's 10-point peace plan is the primary talk of international communities. So what is the 10-point peace plan, and why do I think it's so ridiculous? I will not go in this in detail, but I will go point out every point in it. Radiation and nuclear safety is number 1. That kind of goes around some of the nuclear power plants are being occupied by Russian forces. Food security, that actually ties back to the ability of Ukraine to ship grain out of the Black Sea. That is often a very common food source in a lot of the developing nations. So it's important to the world and it's important to Ukraine. So energy security, same thing. We're seeing all types, a lot of the Russian effort is attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. energy in particular. Release of all prisoners and deportees. That's the deportees part comes up when there was parts that were occupied, that been occupied by the Russians, either still occupied or occupied in the past, and some people were forced to leave their homes and are suspected of being held in Russia. So no issues there. It seems some of these don't really belong as a acceptance for peace plan, but I get the radiation, nuclear safety, food security, energy security. Those don't really seem like those should be sticking points in a peace proposal, especially when you're looking forward to get a ceasefire and an armistice before you negotiate a full peace. Seems kind of some strange elements in there. Implementation of the UN Charter and the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and the world order. It sounds like a lot of buzzwords thrown in there. It's probably a lot to attract some of the more liberal supporters, more of the world order people, or the new world order people. Not meaning that's a conspiracy, but that's probably where they're trying to attract some of the support from. And they have been strong supporters of Ukraine. So obviously he's trying to throw something out to them that he sees a vision that they see in world order. Withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities. Now, this is where it really starts breaking down to me. Prior to any peace talks to start, the Russians have to withdraw. The Russians have to withdraw, and Ukraine's territorial integrity needs to be restored to the 2014 borders. So before peace talks can even start, the Russians have to withdraw all their troops back past the 2014 borders. That includes turning over the Crimea. Now, I don't have an issue necessarily. I think the Russians are the aggressors, but I've also talked in several papers about how we stumbled our way into the war. When I say we, I mean the West, and some of the actions that we've done in between NATO expansion and also interference in Ukrainian politics, both the Russians and the West. So I understand the idea of wanting Ukraine wanting back all their territory, but for that to happen before peace talks even start, basically the Russians are deleveraging everything they have to negotiate with. And when I've written extensively about the demographic hole, or I guess basically a hole that demographically Russia has 3.5 times more people. They just can't get around that. Why is the Ukrainians dictating a peace to the Russians, saying that before any peace can be talked about, they have to withdraw to the 2014 borders? Justice. Okay, that's probably a legitimate concern, but that's not a point to stop hostilities. That's a point to be negotiated during peace talks, not something that has to be accepted by the Russians prior to negotiations. That has to do around war crimes. To what extent that will be, not sure. Obviously, the Russians will never accept making Putin a war criminal. I think The Hague is actually taking up charges, war crime charges against them. Not that that's terribly surprising. I think they actually did that to George W. Bush as well. Immediate protection of the environment. Again, this seems like something speaking to Green supporters. Does not seem like something that should be in the peace talks. I guess you could probably, from the Ukrainian side, to me, this just sounds like buzzwords. Possibly they mean that the Russians can't scorch earth if they withdraw, if they agreed to point number 6 of withdrawing all their forces. Preventing escalation. I think that is a legitimate form. That's Ukraine needs security. I think Russia also wants a buffer state. They've had that since World War II or after World War II. But preventing escalation, that's probably a legitimate discussion point, and then the confirmation of the end of the war. So what President Zelensky wants is he wants all these accepted before he can actually talk about a peace talk. And then it finally ends is that when the Russians accept all these terms, they confirm the end of the war. Okay, so this is not really a roadmap to peace. It's not. They're not a peace is unfortunately a give or take situation for the Ukrainians. There's probably some things they're going to have to give up. They can't get this whole wish list. You start from a position and then you start talking yourself down. Zelensky is talking like, this is it. This is the peace plan. And this is the peace plan that he's dictating to the Russians, but he does not want the Russians invited and the Swiss agreed to it. So we're going to talk about the primary flaw of the peace summit. Russia, first off, has rejected Zelensky's plan because it is not a serious peace proposal. And unfortunately, I do agree with the Russians on that. It is not a serious peace proposal. If you want to compare a serious peace proposal, not saying it's the peace proposal, or compared to this, read my first paper that I put on Substack about what led to the Ukraine war. I do talk about some of what a possible peace could look like. And I think the Turkish peace proposal is something serious to look at. The strength of the Turkish negotiating position is they are trying to play both sides of the fence. They want friendly relations with both Russia and Ukraine. Again, it's amazing that President Erdogan of Turkey is the sane person in the room. That's just saying a lot. I'm sure there's other voices inside Europe that are starting to be heard. Unfortunately, one of them was attempted assassination attempt this week. I would say that he's not really proposing a peace. In fact, that he wasn't proposing anything, but he is one of the people in NATO, I think, along with Orban of Hungary, have been proponents to end the war, and they do tend to favor the Russian position. So the other thing, what I just said, Russia is not invited to the peace conference, and this has been coming up not just from me, and I think I've been talking about this for a while, ever since this was proposed in January at the World Economic Forum. You cannot have a serious peace conference when one of the combatants is not present or represented. When I talk about represented is maybe you have a neutral party negotiate for you. So, for example, we don't have the U.S., meaning we, the United States, does not have diplomatic relations with the Iranians. And for the longest time, the Swiss would be that intermediary between negotiations between the U.S. and Iran outside of major deals like the ill-fated Iran nuclear deal. But that's, so there's nobody representing Russian interests at all. And President Xi Jinping of China stated in France, he visited France about a week and a half ago, stated in France that a successful peace talk has to have both parties, and China will not be present at the conference. So there's not even a Chinese representation, and we'll talk about it later, is China and Russia are very close. So China is not going. Xi is criticizing the fact that these peace talks will not have the Russians involved. So that's another sad fact that I have to agree with Xi Jinping on this one. And that's saying a lot too. So the fact of this is that the Swiss agreed to this. Swiss used to be the all-around neutral party, somebody that most countries viewed as a true arbiter, a neutral arbiter to help negotiate peace. Switzerland has sided with the West, I think probably from the moral point of view. So I'm not really criticizing the Swiss position, but they have not sent military aid, but they're not exactly a neutral in this war either. But more importantly, they signed on to a peace proposal to host peace talks without the Russians there. That was a major failure on the fact of the Swiss, and it's probably damaged their credibility, at least to the Russians. And I don't know how they can necessarily become the long-term arbiter of this peace. The Swiss Foreign Ministry, these are experienced in being neutral, admitted that it was a flaw not to invite Russia, but they tried to save it by saying they would be invited in the future. So despite this flaw, and everybody knows it's a flaw outside the Ukrainians, but we'll come to that in a moment, the peace conference cannot be changed because it will look like the West is publicly abandoning the Ukraine cause. Basically, they have to ride at least the first part of the conference in June. They at least have to ride it in the current format that it is. My personal opinion is the 10-point peace plan will be presented because that's what the agreement was when they started talking at Davos. But I think it's coming quite clear. And I think Zelensky even said something this week about the idea of a fair peace and not talking about the 10-point peace plan. I think they're starting to come forward that this is not the path forward. But they will probably present it as a matter of course, and then they will move on to how they can create a consensus of how to move forward to the peace talks in something that would probably be palatable for the Russians and the Chinese to join. So the Ukraine Foreign Minister, Kuleba, excuse me if I mispronounce that, actually in an interview with, I think, The Economist magazine, it does realize that the format is flawed, and he's getting pressure from the international community, some in the international community, to try to save a purpose of the conference, because without the Russians at the conference, what's the point of having this conference? It just seems like a waste of time. So he stated, first off, he did a justification. He said that Ukraine had over 200 rounds of 200 rounds of policy talks between 2014 to 2022 that failed, and the Russians invaded anyway. So his point is the Russians are not serious negotiators, and that was his justification not to invite them, or that's the Ukrainian position, not to invite the Russians. President Zelensky also mentions many times that he is not allowed by law to negotiate with the Russian. So I think they say that's in their constitution. Okay, we think that's ridiculous because how can you ever end the war? I think that's just something to continue on without as a hiding to keep from having to pursue peace talks. Okay, so Foreign Minister Kuleba is setting a new goal ahead of the conference that the peace talks can include the Russians when the following conditions are fulfilled. And this is an attempt to address the criticism. Now, remember, the Swiss say that eventually the Russians will be invited. And in fact, I think they've even said they're hoping that the next round, after this round in June, that the Russians will agree. It just depends what comes out of this peace conference other than the 10-point peace plan. So to go ahead, so the new goal of the conference is not the 10-point peace plan, but they're cobbling something together now. So the first is to create a coalition of like-minded countries at the Swiss peace talks to pressure the Russians to join those peace talks. Of course, they have to be able to create something that the Russians could possibly see as some type of peace that they could agree to. And this is the concern. They're talking about like-minded countries. So what does that mean? Like-minded countries like Ukraine? And they're supposed to come up with a peace that the Russians are going to agree with? That doesn't seem very serious. So, at least to my mind. So, the other fact is, so they're inviting 100 countries. That's what they're up to, 100 countries, as final numbers not been decided yet. That this like-minded coalition will be difficult since the invitees are not like-minded. Including G7 and BRICS countries, like India. Obviously, China and Russia are part of BRICS. They're not going to be there. But I think most of the other BRICS countries will be there. So you're going to sit there and say like-minded. Okay, G7 and BRICS, they're one wants to maintain the current world order, and the other one wants to displace the other world order. Not a revolution, but they have a different view of how the world economic system and trade should work. So BRICS and G7 are kind of opposite on that. BRICS includes the Russians, G7 doesn't. So how do you form a like-minded coalition to create something of substance that both the Russians and the Ukrainians can agree to? If you're sitting there saying you have to be like-minded, so you have to be like-minded like the Ukrainians, and then G7 and BRICS are supposed to be of the same like mind? Doesn't seem like there's going to be any real consensus, unless the idea is that there could be a fracture coalition coming out of this of, let's say, of the 100 countries invited, 60 join on to whatever like-minded attendees become. So it's very unclear and actually seems ridiculous. It just seems absolutely ridiculous. It seems like if you were going to form a peace talk, you would do something other than trying to find this like-minded coalition that is opposite of the Russians to come up with some magic formula for peace that the Russians would agree to, where they would not see it as anything other than somebody supporting the Ukrainian position. And then if that's going to happen, the Russians are never going to join. Are the Chinese ever going to join? And the Chinese-Russian tie is very important. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But they're of like mind. They're both on the UN Security Council. They both have veto power. So you're not going to invite both of them, and they're very much aligned. So I don't see how you get this like-minded coalition to come up with this idea that the Russians will come up with some peace formula that the Russians will agree to. So that's the one position. The other one is that since it does not include China, Russia will probably not be swayed by any coalition. And so the other thing is, that's the idea of these coalition of like-minded countries. Why is that even necessary? It only takes two parties, Russia and Ukraine, and some neutral arbiter. It could be parties or parties. That's all you need for peace talks. Maybe you have to have a neutral arbiter to come up with a plan, but you do not need a coalition of nations. This just sounds like more ways to make countries feel good about these peace talks coming. So, okay, so I just like, why is a coalition needed? You don't need a coalition to start peace talks. Battlefield success is the other requirement, he's saying. Okay, this is legitimate because, and then hear me out this, I've talked about this before too. It is a legitimate concern to have battlefield success, because without battlefield success or a strong battlefield position, the Russians will not have a reason to negotiate. If Ukraine is weak or defeated on the battlefield, this would mean the Russians would just dictate terms, or they'll just take what they want. They have no reason to give something away in negotiation that they can take on the battlefield. So this is a legitimate concern at a little bit more than face value. The issue is that the Ukrainians, due to their demographics challenges, cannot win this war. They don't have the economic strength to do it. They don't have, more importantly, they don't have the people. And just this week, they finally passed a new draft bill, or a call-up bill, where they can start calling up more people. This has been dragging on for 6 months. As much as Zelensky talks about Western foot dragging, they have dragged themselves by not approving a new draft to pull up more people for the army. But they are challenged. They are demographically challenged, 3.5 to 1 in people. So the West can arm Ukraine. They can make the average Ukrainian soldier more lethal than the Russians, but they cannot overcome that 3.5 to 1 deficit. There's not enough time to pull Ukrainian units out of the field, or take these new draftees to pull them out for the field and spend a better part of a year training them and giving them the Western weapons. There's just not enough manpower in for the Ukrainians to do it. They don't have the manpower, and they cannot pull their forces out to be trained to become more lethal to help overcome some of that issue because the war is ongoing and they're being pressed. So the other issue is that delaying to form a coalition only hurts the Ukraine cause because to be strong on the battlefield. Delays. That is the biggest issue. They are outnumbered 3.5 to 1. The Russians are in a war economy, and looks like they'll probably be able to carry out the war through 2025. So they have the demographic ability, they have the economic ability. Some of the economics can be made up by the West through aid. And again, as I said last week, Ukraine doesn't have to have a GDP as big as Russia does because Russia is a huge country. They have a lot of, just put financial terms, they have a lot of fixed costs because they're a much bigger country. They have to have a GDP to help support that bigger country, especially when you compare it to Ukraine. The biggest deficit is they cannot overcome the demographics. And the longer you wait, the worse their position's going to be. So to sit there and have to wait, that they have to wait for battlefield success. They have to wait for to form this coalition. Every day, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, is they are getting weaker. They either need a huge influx of Western weapons, but it's not even sure they have enough manpower and enough trained manpower to be able to take all these extra new weapon systems. There's obviously some things they can use immediately, artillery shells, mortar shells, stuff they could use immediately, but some of these other weapon systems, they may not have a well enough trained army because, again, the weight of numbers is starting to really squeeze the Ukrainians. Waiting for just delaying, trying to form this coalition this actually will weaken the Ukraine cause over time. So Kuleba and the Swiss Foreign Ministry conditions only make this summit prima facie better than a three-ring circus. There's nothing in this that makes sense. Well, maybe we'll invite the Russians later. We'll come up with these like-minded countries, and we have to have battlefield success. These just are not realistic positions for the Ukrainians to go into peace talks, even trying to save something of what the original plan was. So there are some sober voices in Ukraine. These are not dumb people. And so Major General Vadim Skibitsky, the deputy of Ukraine Military Intelligence Directorate, told The Economist magazine, Kuleba, his article was with Foreign Affairs magazine. Major General Skibitsky is with the Economist magazine. He's just flat out said there's no way for Ukraine to win the war outright. And a negotiated peace is the only way to end the war. He stated that 2024 would be a year that both sides, the Russians and Ukrainians, are trying to create the most favorable battlefield position. Now, this is a legitimate position when you're starting to argue about the going to peace talks because, again, you have to have strong battlefield success. Otherwise, the Russians just dictate terms. So the good thing is that there will not be this, good for the Ukrainians, there will not be this costly spring-summer offensive like we had last year. The West has convinced the Ukrainians to be on the strategic defensive this year, to preserve its strength and rely on the Western weapons and support to exact a higher price on the Russians. This is a smart move because it takes a lot more manpower to conduct an offensive operation than it does a defensive operation. Russia is expected to grow stronger through 2024 and 2025, so it's best that the Ukrainians stay on the defensive. The trade-off is that means that the Russians will have the strategic initiative, but there might be some opportunities for the Ukrainians to take local initiative to counter the Russians as much as they can. But this is an attempt to preserve Ukrainian manpower through 2024 to keep a breakthrough so that they can come to a stronger battlefield position throughout 2024 as General Skibitsky talked about, is 2024, in his opinion, is going to be one jockeying for position to give you that best option to negotiate, give you that stronger option to negotiate at the peace table. The one wild card is the French. They've sent 1,500 troops. I'm not sure if all of them have arrived yet. They are in central Ukraine. They're not in a strictly battlefield role. But France said they would send more troops if the Russians broke through and if Zelensky's requests French assistance. So that's a wild card in about what this will do for 2024. It could be, is this, will the French offer here to help Zelensky in a breakthrough, will this make the Russians less likely to try to commit a breakthrough and just try to straighten their lines, push the Ukrainians back from, let's say, Kharkiv in Russian, Kharkiv in Ukrainian, to pushing them away from Belgorod, the border at Belgorod, and just try to straighten their lines and wear down the Ukrainians and not try to breakthroughs. That way not to initiate the French joining the war? Or is this the French just upping the ante? Or is this an attempt to wind it down? So maybe that's with this threat out there and Zelensky asks for French help and the French send more soldiers, this means that the Russians commit a breakthrough. They would be threatening a widening war if the French are serious about their proposal. The other question is, how long would it take the French to deploy enough forces to make a difference? And then how many would follow the French? So that's the question, is what's the wild card in here? So 2024, even with this peace conference happening, with these unrealistic original expectations, these unrealistic second expectations, and General Skibitsky's interpretation of what's going to happen, that 2024 is going to be a jockeying year, I tend to agree with it. That's what it appears to be. Nobody seems to be serious about peace talks, even when they're having this media circus about peace talks in Switzerland this year. It's just not serious. So at 2024, we're just going to see the war continue through 2024, which just hope that nothing else escalates during this time. So the spring offensive has basically started on the Russian side. How this will go? Will it be trying to do a breakthrough? Will they do like General Grant did at Petersburg and just stretched Lee's lines until eventually they became so weak that a breakthrough was inevitable? Because you could see that it seems like the Russians are moving, are trying to stretch the Ukraine reserves. So we will see. I know that they want more. Western weapons are on the way, and they are asking for more. Also, Ukrainians are asking to be able to have weapons to attack Russia itself. There's been a restriction both by the U.S. and the U.K. I think there is Simon Whistler does some great channels on YouTube. Has talked about, he's blaming that the U.S. is withholding aid to the Ukrainians, saying that they cannot have any weapons that can reach into Russian territory. If you're out there listening, which he's not, the UK has that too. This is just not a US issue. The UK also has the same restrictions. The French seem to have removed those restrictions, and it looks like the UK most likely will remove those restrictions. So that could only escalate the war as well. So we'll see as the weapons arrive to see if that's going to end up seeing more attacks on Russia itself and what that will do in the war. All right, so more to come. I will keep revisiting this, especially as we get closer to June, and see if they come off of anything more real than what they're proposing originally and what their plan B is, which is just about as unrealistic. So Okay, so the next one is the Philippines challenge another Chinese incursion in its exclusive economic zone. Um, Got to give it to the Philippines. Filipino people do not back down, as I said last week. No better friend and no more tenacious enemy. And I think they're proving that to the Chinese. So this week, something new and exciting was instead of in the Scarborough Shoals or the Second Thomas Shoal, this was in the Escoda Shoal, where there's a recent incident that occurred, and the Philippine reaction to it is this just a new tactic to frustrate the Chinese. I say this about a new tactic because, excuse me, Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro said that after the Scarborough Shoal incident, where the Chinese took the water cannon to a Chinese Coast Guard ship and a fishery ship, which was the first time they ever used water cannons against a government ship. The Secretary of National Defense said that they needed to change their tactics. They needed to stop telegraphing. They needed to try something different. And what happened in the Escoda Shoal is something different. So as I said, there's been 3 repeating incidents. In fact, one of them even occurred this week, and I will release that paper today. So go out there and read it. There will be a video on it tomorrow, or a full form video on it as well. So we'll talk more about what's going on and events this week. So the areas that have been coming up the most is the Second Thomas Shoal, the Scarborough Shoal, and that's the one that brought up the issue from Secretary Teodoro, where it said that they needed to change their tactics. Was the incident in the Scarborough Shoal where the water cannons were used against 2 Philippine government ships. And that's also where we saw an event happen last week. And again, be in my paper on Substack. Please go out and read it, but we will talk about it next week as well. And the new one is the Escoda Shoal. So the Philippine Coast Guard, and this is going back about, I think when I wrote this, it was 28 days, so 4 weeks of monitoring by the Philippines. The Philippine Coast Guard monitored 34 militia vessels, 4 Coast Guard ships, 3 People's Liberation Army Navy ships, including one with a helicopter, and a research vessel with divers around the shoal. So the Philippines followed up, and they found crushed coral around the shoal. And so this is apparently China is trying to build an artificial island only 75 miles from Palawan Island. That is one of the main islands of the Philippine island chain. So that's within 75 miles. Of course, it's still within international waters, being 75 miles away, but that's very close. Also, it could block any efforts by the Philippines to approach the Second Thomas Shoal. So this is something that's unacceptable to the Philippines, understandably so. First off, this means that, first off, when we started going about the 9-dash line and where all the shoals were and the rocky outcroppings, the Chinese started building artificial islands to try to reinforce their claim, militarize these new man-made islands, and allow them as stations for the Coast Guard as well, or resupply areas to help the Coast Guard stay out there to patrol the outer limits of or the outer border of the South China Sea, or the West Philippine Sea, which is used to be called the South China Sea. So anything that's in the South China Sea but is part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, that's the West Philippine Sea, as the Filipinos like to call it, and I like to adopt that as well. As I will admit, I am biased. I'm very supportive of the Philippine position, that they just keep going, and they're just not backing down. So I will admit my bias on this. So this crushed coral that had been used, that China has a history of using crushed coral to make artificial islands. So apparently the Chinese got caught building an artificial island on the Escoda Shoal. So this obviously 75 miles away from the Palawan Island. This cannot be accepted by the Philippines, so close to one of their islands and well within their exclusive economic zone. So this is an unacceptable position for the Philippines. It would be, again, as I discussed, if they built a working island and manned it, it would give them the ability to interdict any activities going to the Second Thomas Shoal and other parts of the EEZ. Second Thomas Shoal isn't actually manned shoal because it's got the grounded ship, the Sierra Madre, that's manned by Philippine Marines. So the Philippines sent their largest Coast Guard vessel to monitor for about, at the time I wrote this, I think it was 28 days, along with 2 other Coast Guard vessels to keep the Chinese out of the area. So I think the position is the Chinese are not going to go in there and try to build while the Chinese Coast Guard is sitting right there. Also, the Philippines are sending out researchers to try to discover where the coral came from to confirm its origin. The Philippines suspect that coral came from another location and was being boated in by the Chinese to dump on the island. So they think that when they start researching what this coral is, they will find, most likely, or it's hoped, they will find the location that it came from. And this will be able to provide proof that this is not something that is coincidental, that it's just somehow crushed coral just made its way to the Escoda Shoal. The other fact is that and this is what's important, they've made this point, is the Philippines sent their largest Coast Guard vessel to the Escoda Shoal along with 2 smaller Coast Guard vessels. A good portion of the Chinese Coast Guard ships are former People's Liberation Army Navy ships. They've taken out the weapons like the vertical launchers. The vertical launchers are still there, but they're empty. And I think they took out some of the fire control systems so that they can maintain that they're not military but Coast Guard vessels. These, because they are former warships, they are of much higher tonnage than the Philippine ships that run into at the Scarborough Shoal or the Second Thomas Shoal. And the common tactic of the Chinese Coast Guard is to use ramming. Obviously, if you have a bigger, heavier ship, you're going to come out on top on ramming attacks. So now the Chinese have sent their largest Coast Guard vessel there. If the Chinese tried to ram that one, they would take a lot more, the Chinese ships would take a lot more damage and threaten their own existence. So most likely they will not attempt to ram such a large ship. So the Philippines is definitely taking a position by sending the big dogs in and trying to shoo the Chinese away from the area and also conduct their investigation. So the reason why I think it's important that they're sending researchers, I suspect, again, a lot of this is a public relations campaign on top of the constant going back to the Chinese the Philippines going back after the Chinese. So I think there's twofold that's going on. I think they're going back to the international, they're trying to build a case to go back to the International Maritime Court. China's not going to pay attention. They've lost twice in the court, and they're still doing what they do in the South China Sea. The idea is that they want to expose the Chinese for the actions that they're doing. They want to give them more illegitimacy in the court. This will make them harder to find allies in the South China Sea. People that are countries that are on the fence may be swung not to deal with China because of their illegal activities that are being broadcasted, being publicized, being in court by the Philippines. The Philippines, now that every time they go to the show, they bring cameras. They've got reporters, and they're just not Philippine reporters. They're bringing international press. They're bringing the drones in. They're filming everything. They're documenting everything. The Chinese can't hide what they're doing in the shoals. And the Philippines are bringing the heat on them by publicizing all this. And this is to a country that is they're very much their international reputation. How they appear to other countries is very important to the Chinese. They're very defiant, And it's hard to defy something or argue something when it is going to be broadcasted. So that is one of the Philippines' position, is they're broadcasting this. I think they're wanting to build a case to take it back to court. Not that they're going to win, or no, they're going to win. They will win. They've won twice, they will win a third time. This is just the win to them is going to be putting this back out there, more pressure on the Chinese and how they appear to the world. It's harder to sell Belt and Road initiatives when the Philippines are building a level of distrust. You can't trust the Chinese. The Chinese are bullies. The Chinese demand their own way. This could eventually hurt some of the Belt and Road initiatives, which I know they're moving away from that name, but they're still doing these economic projects. There's going to be countries that are going to be less likely to accept it or being much more suspicious of what the Chinese are doing. So either they're going to say no to the Chinese, we're not accepting these new deals with you, or they're going to ask for a much higher price for the Chinese to comply, which could bring in a whole nother issues. The other part is, and this is some of the gray zone tactics too, but which I'll discuss it's in the paper today. Go out and read it, please. Is the Philippines, if they just stop going to these shoals, if they just give up, they pull out of the Sierra Madre, they stop going to the Scarborough Shoal, they let the island be built in the Escoda Shoal, they are basically surrendering to the Chinese demands. And by default, it could be viewed as that, well, these are now Chinese territory because you have abandoned the claims. Even if they don't formally do it, but if the Philippines never go to these locations, it's going to be easier for the Chinese to justify that just by the fact that a smaller country has given up and not trying to confront China on these claims, is by default it could be viewed that the Chinese are, okay, this is our territory now because we're the only ones that inhabit this area. The Philippines keep going back, they keep going back, they keep going back. They are not giving up this claim. And even though they're going in there and not forcing a military showdown, they're not shooting cannons, they're coming. They maintain people on the Second Thomas Shoal, on the Sierra Madre, so they're not giving up that. There's challenges with the Sierra Madre because it's in desperate need of repair, and the Chinese are not allowing them to repair it. But it's a manned presence in the Second Thomas Shoal. Scarborough Shoal, there's no buildings in that shoal. The Chinese don't have buildings. And the Chinese Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia have surrounded that area. They're a constant presence, but the Philippines are a constant presence as well. They have fishermen around the shoal. They're not allowed to get into the shoal itself, but they're around in the area. They are taking positions within the EEZ not to give up the claim. And they go in there and they occasionally go back and try to reestablish their position inside the EEZ. So the Philippines are not giving this up. So the position is that I think that's what they're doing. They're not giving up by manning, like making a presence. They're not giving up the claims to the Chinese in the EEZ, in their EEZ, and they're getting ready to build a criminal case. Now, again, the Chinese aren't going to listen to the criminal case, but why it matters, and I just talked about this, is this could impact how other countries in the Western Pacific specifically, is how they view it. So these countries might be swayed to join this loose American-led coalition that's forming in the Pacific. And this will be pressure against China because China is very clear they don't want foreign elements inside to form, or they don't want the countries in the Western Pacific forming alliances with a foreign element, the United States, Japan, UK, France. They don't want any of that. Australia, New Zealand, they don't want any of that. So if they want to keep them out, they're probably going to have to give up something in negotiating, though I don't see them completely giving up the South China Sea. But this is where this campaign to turn other opinions against China, other countries' opinion against China, will put pressure on China. So a country may not side with China in the end, but it will find its place that it's not going to side with it either. So this could be the hope of the Philippine position, is let's make in international opinion, let's make the Chinese lose. let's make them lose face and then present this out to other parts of the Pacific, probably led by the United States and Japan, to make this position known, that countries will start siding against China, and this will put pressure on them. Will it work? I don't know. But it will definitely put pressure on them to operate how they can operate in their backyard if they have no allies, or they have hesitant allies. And it's not going to help them in their Belt and Road initiatives. So more to come. I wrote about it this week, so I'll talk more about it next week. It'll be interesting to see where this goes. It doesn't seem like they're not stopping. So the last paper for this week was the Chinese-Russia Summit, a snap meeting to react to Western sanctions. So believe it or not, this week was a snap meeting, unannounced. It was announced on Tuesday that Vladimir Putin was going to meet with Xi Jinping in Beijing for 2 days. It was announced on Tuesday. He arrived on Thursday. So this was I call it a snap meeting. This was the 43rd meeting between Putin and Xi. This one taking place, as I said, in Beijing. And it appears to be to firm up the Russian and Chinese approach to Western sanctions. There's been some changes over the past month over some of the pressure on sanctions, not only against Russia, but also going after the Chinese. So it's funny that China this week was lecturing the South Koreans on getting closer to the United States and Japan, because they had that trilateral summit, or that bilateral summit, and then the trilateral bringing the Philippines, where they started with the Koreans and Japanese are joining forces to do some missile monitoring and also some other intelligence sharing and probably some more coordination between the navies. This is big. This has been something that even though South Korea or Republic of Korea and Japan have been strong U.S. allies for quite some time, decades and decades, they did not coordinate with each other. It was basically leftover hard feelings and suspicion from World War II. The Chinese threat in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, is putting together Japan, or pulling Japan and South Korea together. So the Chinese lectured the South Korean foreign ministry on that, stating that it was changing their relationship, and it was not for the good. So it was basically saying that South Korea is making the Western Pacific less safe, which is kind of funny because the North Koreans, they're very bellicose, and the Chinese can't completely control them, but they can put more pressure on the North Koreans than what they do. So the Chinese bear some of that responsibility of the pulling together of Japan and South Korea, first over the North Korean missile launches and nuclear program, and now that with China being more bellicose against Taiwan and the claims in the South China Sea, you're starting to see the pulling together of two strong militaries very close to China and very much against China in the Western Pacific. And so this is not something that the Chinese wanted to see. So they go in again talking about don't bring foreign elements into alliances. And that was a lot of discussion. And then they announced this 43rd summit between Russia and China. So again, I made a little quip, this is hypocrisy. They talk about this unlimited friendship between China and Russia. I think that came from Xi. And I just call it just the balance of unlimited hypocrisy of the Chinese. The Chinese are against alliances. They don't want alliances when it is alliances forming against them, but they're perfectly okay forming their own alliance with Russia that benefits them both militarily and economically. So they're fine with that. And also, this ties back into to the Ukraine war. Obviously, even though China is not a party to the Ukraine war, they're not a party at the peace talks. They are supporting the Russian positions about not attending the peace talks in Switzerland. And it's because China and Russia see the world in a very similar way. Now, let's give China credit where credit is due. China has been very publicly against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even prior to the Ukraine invasion occurring. When it looked like it was apparent it was going to happen, the Chinese were publicly against it. Now, that doesn't mean they tried to stop the Russians. They just came out and said they would prefer not to have a war in Europe. It did play a significant role to get Russia to dial back its nuclear threats against the Ukraine and the West. So it will give credit to the Chinese to in their position approaching a war and the threats that have been coming from Russia and Putin's allies in Russia. So it has also, but on the other side, China has been a very vocal opponent of international sanctions against Russia. And they talk about that they're against the sanctions, but they also very much benefit from these sanctions because it has forced Russia to come to China. Excuse me, I have to take a drink. Okay, so even though they don't like the sanctions against Russia, they have definitely benefited economically from the sanctions. I've talked about this many times. Russia and India do receive Russian oil at a discount. There's also price capping. Russian oil can only be sold at a certain price. So Russia needs to sell its oil. It needs the revenue from it. The West does not, and I've talked about this before, the West is not too serious about trying to stop Russian oil because they want the Russian oil on the market. But they just don't, they want to limit the amount of money that the Russians can make off of oil sales. So they did some capping, but also to incentivize countries to buy, China and India to buy Russian oil and keep the money flowing into the Russian economy. They do sell it at a discount, and that was estimated to be $10 billion in savings in 2023. And in 2024, so far, it's estimated to be $4 billion. And I think that was through March. So it actually looks like they are buying more oil from the Russians than they did in 2023. At least they're on pace to do that. So, I have to turn the page here. So the other part is China's trade with Russia was just under 30% prior to the war. Today, or in 2023, end of 2023, the last reporting month, it was 88% of trade with Russia. Now, this is China's trade with Russia. This is not Russia's overall trade, which has fallen outside of oil. This is China's actual trade with Russia. So it's gone up from 30% to 88%. So also machine tools have increased 120% by the end of 2022 compared to the prior year. And then on top of that 120% increase, it increased another 170% in 2023. This has been used to support Russian industry. The Russians have gone to a war economy, or moving towards a war economy. At least that's how the West is interpreting it. And they've talked about, even with the sanctions, the West have talked about, even with the sanctions, the Russian economy continues to grow. They're continue to produce more weapons. They're be able to expand the capacity. So even though they've been cut off from a lot of these items, it looks like they are still able to build up their war production capability. Now, China has not sold Russia any weapons or ammunition. You can't say the same with North Korea. Has sold a lot of weapons, mainly missiles and a lot of artillery ammunition to Russia. China has not done any of that. And it's not even suspected that they're even selling military parts to specific military technology to the Russians either. So they're not even providing them systems that have just a military use. What the West believes and about the above is that China is selling the Russians what's called dual-use items. And these are items that both have a military and a civilian application. So here's some examples of some dual-use technologies. Nitrocellulose. It's used in civilian explosives, lacquers, and paints. But it also is used for modern gunpowder, and it's the propellant for artillery shells. The Russians have stepped up production of artillery shells considerably. They needed more nitrocellulose, and the Chinese are providing it. So the Chinese are facilitating the increase of Russian artillery production. 90% of all microelectronics traded in Russia come from China. And these are things that can be used in civilian consumer goods like cars, refrigerators, cameras, stuff like that. But they can also be used in military vehicles, aircrafts, drones, and missiles. So these are things that it's just they need the microelectronics to run the computers on weapon systems, and the Chinese are providing 90% of the microelectronics. Not sure where the other 10% is coming from, though. I suspect it's probably coming from Iran, but I can't say for sure. I could try to find some information. I couldn't find who else was trading it. Optics. Talk about infrared, telescopic. These have civilian uses, obviously. Cameras, infrared. These also have military use in both aircraft and military vehicles. Chinese are providing a fair amount of the optics. China is also selling finished goods like military-grade vehicles to Central Asian republics that turn around and sell them to Russia. So the only reason they know this is that they have found Chinese trucks, relatively new Chinese trucks in Ukraine. Not seen Chinese tanks. So again, they're kind of sticking to this dual use, but these are military-grade vehicles that are being found in Ukraine that have an origin in China and appear to be filtering through the Central Asian republics. And remember, most of those Central Asian republics used to be former Soviet republics. They're still within the Russian sphere of influence. The Russians still have a lot of influence in those regions. So these countries are helping out Russia as to facilitate the trade. These are not that, hey, I'm going to just throw out a name. Kazakhstan said, hey, I want to buy 5,000 trucks. Then they turn around and sell them to the Russians. The intent was always they would buy 5,000 trucks and they would probably turn around and sell them to the Russians at some form of markup. So this was always intentional to move these products through the Central Asian republics and never meant to be the Central republics to be the end point for these products. So this is a big concern. So obviously it looks like the West does seem to have proof that this is occurring. So two separate trips between Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken both went to China at separate times to meet with Xi Jinping to discuss Chinese trade in dual-use products. Again, this is all framed around the war in Ukraine. French President Macron met with Xi in France. Xi came to France earlier this month. He went to France, Hungary, and I think Serbia is where he visited in Europe when he was there. So when he was in France, which was his first stop, and he met personally with Macron for, I think, 2 days, they discussed the war in Ukraine and the support that China is apparently giving to Russia in its war. Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, went to Beijing to discuss as well. So obviously this West is taking this dual-use trade seriously. And they are threatening further sanctions against Chinese banks. And that's what a lot of there was to provide, I guess, some form of proof, also to show how serious the West is about this dual-use trade. but they were also threatening to sanction Chinese corporations that were involved in the trade with Russia in facilitating these dual-use products. So the U.S. is discussing sanctions, and I think they might have already started implementing sanctions against Chinese banks that facilitate the trade with Russia and the to facilitate these dual-use trades. The EU is threatening the same as well against the Chinese banks. And the Europeans have made it very clear that they're viewing, and this is a relatively recent position, kind of and well, I won't go into that, but anyway, there was a saying, but I kind of lost it, so sorry about that. Well, basically, what the Europeans are saying that the Chinese support with these dual-use products in them is the Chinese, by doing this and helping the Russians in their war in Ukraine, the Chinese are a threat to European security. That was delivered by both Macron and Scholz, the two most powerful countries in the European Union. The result of these threats is that the Chinese trade in March and April with Russia had considerably dropped. Just apparently the threat against these banks was more than enough to start pulling back on trading with Russia. And the quick nature of the summit appears to be to reestablish that trade as maybe looking for a way to work around the sanctions. Now, the Chinese banks that sit there, that they're not their sole purpose in life is to sell products to the Russians. They sell to the open markets of Asia and the West. So they don't want to threaten that lucrative trade either by supporting just the Russians. So obviously they did not want to be sanctioned by the West. So that is the reason they started pulling back on the trades with Russia. So it appears that that's the reason why Putin made this snap decision to go to Beijing. So there is a symbiotic relationship between Russia and China. Russia needs Chinese help to continue the war in Ukraine and to grow its industrial capacity for its war economy. Again, to fight the war in Ukraine. China needs Russia's help to counterbalance the U.S. coalition that is gathering against China and their attempts to promote BRICS and to displace the petrodollar. I also did a short video this week about the petrodollar, some of the history of it. So go out there and listen to that if you want to. So the Chinese need that help from Russia. Russia is a member of the Security Council. Russia is a very large country with very great resources, and China can use what Russia can provide, both the natural resources. It is has the most nuclear weapons in the world. It is a very technology able country. And so there's a lot of what Russia can provide to China to help strengthen it so that it can create a coalition against the U.S. or create a diplomatic counterbalance to the U.S. Because the U.S., as we have talked about earlier, the U.S. is forming a lot of alliances in the Pacific to counterbalance the Chinese. The Chinese need the Russians to counterbalance that building coalition. So also, both need access to international markets. Russia needs to sell its oil to support its economy. So they predominantly sell a lot of their oil to India. They sell a lot of it to China. That's probably where most of their oil sells, but they still do sell it in other locations. In fact, there's ways around the sanctions. I've talked about this at another paper about the growing Russian economy. There's actually Russian oil is making its way into Europe, and it's legal. So Russia needs that marketplace, both China and in other places, to support its war economy. So it needs the outside. It's got oil. It has more than enough oil that it can use. It needs to sell it to be able to keep its economy going. So the world economy needs Russian energy to keep a stable energy market. They don't need all the Russian oil to be cut off from the market, and because that would cause, let's say for some reason they could find a way to enforce it. If India and China stopped buying Russian oil and took it completely off the market, and it was just, there's no reason for Russia to pump it anymore because there's nowhere to sell it, the energy needs are still out there. And if OPEC doesn't increase energy production, the price of oil will skyrocket. 50% of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been sold off, and is all attempts to replenish it this year have been so far suspended. So there's the ability to swing such a spike if you took Russian oil off the market. It's just not there. So in this case is the world needs Russian energy to stay in the economy. They can't have these price oil shocks. They can't have these energy shortages with inflation still being pesky in the West. They cannot afford to have spiking energy prices. So the West wants Russian energy to remain in the market. They just want to find a way to make it a little bit painful to sell it. And they also want to cap the price that Russians can make on it. China needs access to the open markets of the West to keep its economy going. So the trade with Russia, though it's gone up, I mentioned it earlier it's 88% of trade with China represents 88% of the trade with Russia. That's not enough to compensate for this Western economy. See, Western economies are dramatically bigger. I think the Netherlands has a bigger economy than Russia. China needs those open markets. China has been, they've got an expensive military buildup. They have a lot of activities that are continuing to grow, and they have a lot of headwinds in their economy. There's been a general downturn in the economy in the world, which means there's less demand for Chinese product. There is also decoupling going on, where the foreign countries are looking at leaving China to go to other locations, mainly India, or onshoring back to the U.S. and Mexico. So the Chinese cannot afford to just give up those Western markets. They need all the help they can get. So despite all this complaining and gnashing of teeth about Western sanctions and all this, they still need the West. The Russians and the Chinese need it, which, okay, we can go into that. We're helping facilitate the war in Ukraine by allowing Russian oil to be sold, which is our primary commodity. So what does that say about Western energy policy, that they are so subject to? They can't even fully sanction Russia because they can't afford to have Russian energy come off the market because they have no way of replacing it. So it tells you a lot about energy policies. Green energy is not there yet. Someday it will be, but it's not there, not there yet, and it will not be anytime within the next at least 2 decades, unless there's some breakthrough with fusion power. So the genie that's always 20 years away. So the U.S. and the EU are just not threatening sanctions against China over its dual-use trade, but at the same time, the U.S. and the EU is also following on, but the U.S. in a grand strategy this week issued a series of tariffs against electric vehicles and other green products from China. This is completely separate of the dual use. This is a separate issue altogether. So they're issuing tariffs on green products and EVs. There's a threat of that because of all the excess capacity in the Chinese economy, they might be getting ready to dump the market, world market, with cheap electric vehicles. that will destroy a lot of the sectors of the Western economy because they cannot match the price of the Chinese vehicles. And then other solar panels, I think windmill generators. So these EV tariffs can say that this is a legitimate form of trade disputes and negotiations. If you're a free trade person, obviously you're against tariffs, but you can find an argument at least to take the understanding that yes, they can be used. Tariffs can be used as a way to settle trade disputes or to be protectionist. It just depends how far they carry it. That's going after the manufacturing sector of the Chinese economy. So what I talked about earlier was when Yellen and Blinken and Schultz and Macron all met with Xi, they were talking about going after banks that are helping support the trade of dual-use products. This is also a legitimate form of disputes, and this is going after the economic sector of China. So two separate policies for two separate issues are both being directed at China. I'm not saying that they don't deserve it, but it's just a matter of what are we doing here. So what's happening here is that these two attacks on the Chinese sector to put pressure on them on the Ukraine war, but then also to keep the Chinese from flooding the market with cheap products. These are actually things that are starting to push China closer to Russia because it can see that there's probably no position that it's going to be able to satisfy the West. During the Cold War, and especially when Nixon had visited and opened up relations with China, the U.S. policy was to keep China and the Soviet Union apart, keep them from forming a communist bloc. And that used to be U.S. policy because the idea was, okay, they were together during the Korean War. Mao Zedong, when he came to power in China in 1949. Obviously, Joseph Stalin was, I think he died in 52. They were close together. They were supporters of each other for the Korean War. Obviously, Russia was more in the background. China very much in the foreground with North Korea. The U.S. policy was the idea of keeping these two countries apart. This weakened the Soviet Union because they could not completely disregard China. And China had border disputes with the Soviet Union. So the idea was to keep these two from getting together. Don't let them overcome their differences. Let them be suspicious of each other. Now the policy that we're doing, meaning we, the West, the United States, is we're pushing them together. So the meeting through this is now snap meeting. They got to get together, meaning China and Russia. So the Chinese and the Russians need to find a way to obfuscate the trade issues to continue the trade they both need. China needs to be cautious because they do not need to lose access to the markets. The Russians are probably safe. Again, the West is not in a position to be able to take Western oil off of it. This is going to be, any breaking of the sanctions is probably going to be directed to China. China's the one who has the most to lose. So they have to form some type of trade deal to continue to increase those. When March and April drop so precipitously, Russia doesn't need that to happen. They need to bring those trade levels back up to keep its economy going for finished military goods to continue the war. So this is what the idea, that this meeting was a way to get around Western sanctions and a way to hide it, that they don't go after banks, whether they pass it through third parties. There were some other discussions about Russia wants firm commitments from the Chinese to buy an oil pipeline or help fund the oil pipeline, that China will continue to buy Russian oil, Russians don't want to go through the expense of building a pipeline, and then the Chinese give in to Western sanctions and stop buying Western oil. The Russians need a concrete commitment from the Chinese to continue to buy Russian oil. No longer using tankers, but just using pipelines to deliver it. So Russians need that. Russians are also looking at a way to use Chinese financial markets to trade in the Chinese currency, at a way to start financing into the outside world. So they want that as well. Obviously, China wants, obviously, they want to continue the oil trade, and probably looking at the long-term commitments to other raw materials. Gas is one to continue coming from Russia, because again, there is a significant savings to the Chinese economy by buying Russian fuel and gas. So the other thing is that neither can give up the relationship with the open market. Russia needs to sell its oil, Chinese needs to sell its manufactured goods. So they have to do this in a way that they do not give up, or they do not, especially the Chinese, do not bring the brunt of Western sanctions. Again, the Russians are pretty secure in the oil sales because the West is not going to get rid of Russian oil out of the market. Now, what could happen, though, is if the West can hurt the Chinese economy significantly, again, there's not enough GDP in Russia to replace, for Russia to replace the lost trade with the open markets of the West and the developing countries, the G7 countries. If the Chinese economy starts going downhill, they're going to buy less Russian oil. And there's not guaranteed that there would be a customer base for that Russian oil unless OPEC, Russia is a member of OPEC Plus, unless OPEC reduces production and forces the world to start buying Russian oil. But as of now, considering all things are equal, and that will not happen with OPEC, is China cannot take a big hit in its economy. If it takes a hit in the economy, it needs less oil, and it buys less oil from Russia. Russia gets less money from the Chinese, and that hurts their ability to conduct the war. But they both need access to the West. Chinese have more to lose than the Russians, because the West is hooked to oil and energy. We all are. That's what makes modern society run. So it's not like meant that as a derogatory statement. It's just a matter of how the world works right now. The West is not ready to decouple with China completely. They're moving towards it, but India is the biggest decoupling location, and India is not ready yet. India is continuing to build its infrastructure. They cannot just simply give up China all at once. And Russia energy needs to stay on the market because the economies I talked about that due to the inflationary pressures, especially in the U.S., to a lesser extent in Europe at this particular moment, cannot afford a big price shock in the energy sector that put more pressure on inflation. So the West, how far are they going to push with this? They will push China. They will not push the Russians. They'll push the Russians in other ways by arming the Ukrainians, but they will not. I think as far as they will go with the Russian oil sector is as far as they're going to go. They will try to hurt the Russians' purchases of dual use by putting pressure on the Chinese. How the Chinese will go with this, they're going to find some way to get closer to Russia to help insulate themselves from being identified with these trades, or with the possible trades or possible sanctions applied against the banks that facilitate the trade with Russia. And when I talked about earlier, when I talked about the EV tariffs going after the manufacturing sector, and that is a legitimate form of trade disputes and negotiation process. And then the sanctioning of Chinese banks is to go after the economic sector, which is directly tied to the Ukraine war. If it wasn't for the Ukraine war, that part would not even be being discussed, and it would be just a one focus item, and that's on the tariffs of the EV cars and the green sector. Now, during President Trump, he was obviously when he was in the presidency, he was he was using tariffs against the Chinese to get them to come to the bargaining table. There was not a Ukraine war going on. Those negotiations were incredibly difficult, just like they are with any trade negotiations. They are extraordinarily difficult to negotiate as both sides try to get the most favorable terms for their own countries. These are hard to manage. These are hard to manage in peacetime. It's hard to fight that reflexive protectionism of both countries where one's trying to one up the other. These are hard things to negotiate. It's hard to negotiate a fair trade deal. It is nearly impossible to do this while there's a war going on in Europe, the biggest land war since World War II. This has made negotiating trade extraordinarily difficult, and while trying to manage a sanction regime. It is incredibly hard to do this. It is probably bound to failure, whether it will be more half measures or it will, in the long term, push China and Russia into an even more closer relationship. And this is just another example of how the Ukraine war has been such a disastrous event in international relations. The East and the West were getting further and further apart, even before the war, and this has just pushed it even further apart. And if we continue, in the U.S., if we continue to push the Chinese, which is not necessarily a wrong approach, I would look at it I would say it's an absolute failure in Western energy policy. But and we can talk about what I think that what the U.S. and the West could do about energy policy to make them more insular to things like that's going on into the war. Just imagine. This is all speculative. What if there was enough energy independence in the West that they could afford to up production and cut the world off from Russian oil? And they could actually cut the Chinese off to keep them from buying, and the Indians from buying Western or buying Russian oil. What if Russia could not sell its oil? What would that war look like? Now, would have, could have, should have. You can't have excess capacity to build out, to be able to up your production of oil when there's no war ever occurs. But imagine if that was an actual deterrent for war, energy independence of the West. Yeah, it would have changed the whole dynamic of how the sanction regime goes, which is so far, yep, we will give money to the Ukrainians to help fight the war that they did not initiate. The Ukrainians are not at fault for the war. There's some things the Ukrainians could have done better as far as how their government was run and the corruption issues, but they didn't ask to be invaded, so I'm not faulting the Ukrainians in this. The Russians in the West obviously interfered in Ukrainian politics. The Russians did not need to invade. But just imagine how different the world would be if there was a way to prevent that war from ever happening. So we're paying the Ukrainians to stay in the war, providing them weapons. And when I say we, the U.S. and the West, and we're allowing Russian oil to continue to be sold on the world market so that Russia can pay for its war. So you wonder why there's no chance that it's not negotiated, that there's no peace settlement yet, is because nobody's really cutting off the money. They're spending money. Russians are, the West is, but there's no serious way to approach to put pressure on the Russians. The pressure right now is going to be all on the Chinese, and they're going to try to find a way to continue that relationship with the Russians. Maybe they'll push Russia to negotiate so that they don't put themselves too far over their skis as far as pushing the limits of the sanction regime. So we'll see. So more to come on that one. It's just more and more as I read more and more about the sanctions. When you took them at face value, you think, oh, we're cutting the world off from Russian oil. And it's like, no, not really. Just making it a little bit more difficult, harder to ship. Insurance rates are high. There's some funny things that have to go on about their ports of call, and they have caps, but for the most part, the Russians are selling just about as much oil as they were prior to the war. So those are the three papers that this week. It was a pretty good week on Substack, much better week on Rumble and YouTube. I guess that's expected. Those are both bigger sites than Substack. Video is obviously a very popular form. Also, though, Apple Podcast and Spotify are doing well, but all podcasts are still on Substack. I say all that. I'm not going to change. Substack is the outlet. I am a writer first, so I will continue to publish on Substack, even though I have more followers on Rumble and YouTube. I will continue to use the Substack as my outlet. One thing just mention out there is I found today an issue with the service I use for my short videos, which is just a video summary of my weekly papers. The service I use, I write all the scripts for them, and then the videos are applied, and then I have to go through video editing process. The place took away the ability to just do my word for word script. So I had to switch to another one, and it's not near as smooth as the other one. It's not as polished as the other one, which still needed some polishing in this one. So I felt like I kind of took a step backwards on the short video. So I am going to be working through that one. At first I thought about the idea of eliminating that form, but it actually does pretty well as far as the views go. And the idea is that if I can get views on YouTube, if I can get views on Rumble, the hope is that I can start directing more traffic to the Substack side. Also, eventually, somewhere in the distant future, I'll be able to get some form of monetization for my work so that I can help continue to fund all this activity, which I found this week was not a cheap alternative. But hopefully that I've done a lot of the initial payments of it, and I can start reaping some of the rewards of it. I know I'm not unrealistic about it. It might take a year to do that. I didn't get any money necessarily off of it, but I got enough attention on Rumble that actually I had Rumble start a company started running ads on my videos. So hopefully that will add up, and you get a little bit of help somewhere, and then eventually starts kind of snowballing. So I will continue my work on that. So be patient with me while I work out the issue with the short videos to make them a little bit more polished. More work to come on that one. I have a couple ideas, just a matter of probably dropping the subscription service on one and just focusing on moving every activity over to another. We'll see. So please be patient as I work through the issues on that one while still maintaining my full-time job. So if you, again, if you like my content and you want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber, both paid or just a free subscriber on Substack. Again, the idea is the more subscribers I get, the more it helps with providing some legitimacy in the channel. Very few people will take you seriously, no matter how good you write or how much of good points that you make. If you only got 19 followers, I did get a new follower this week, so thank you for that. Also, if you want to support me on Patreon, that is also an option. It would be very much appreciated. Also, I had some good comments from my Philippine. Some of them were subscribed members or joined my YouTube channel, but they also gave a lot of great comments. So I appreciate that. Until next week, again, some of the tie-ins this week, I wrote more about some of the activities in the South China Sea between the Philippines and the Chinese. Ties into what I wrote about with the Philippines challenge another Chinese incursion in the exclusive economic zone. There's a follow-on to that. Always constantly going with that. Again, credit to the Philippines from not backing down from the Chinese threats. So I just want to give a shout out to that. Again, that is probably my one really big bias. I am definitely supporting the efforts of the Philippine people in standing up against the Chinese ridiculous aggressions in the South China Sea. So until next week, when we'll do the 10th version of this podcast, I hope all of you have a good week and a good evening, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.